Chapter 2, Unit 2, Cognition. Part 2.1, Perception. What is perception and why does it matter? Let's start with a question. When you look at a coffee cup sitting on a table, are you seeing it or are you interpreting it? That distinction is everything in this unit. A sensation is the raw data, light waves hitting your retina, sound waves vibrating your eardrum. Perception is what your brain does with that data. It's the meaning-making process, and it's happening constantly, automatically. And here's the kicker, subjectively. Two people can sense the exact same stimulus and perceive it in completely different ways. That's what makes perception one of the most fascinating and AP exam-friendly topics in all of psychology. Bottom-up versus top-down processing. Think of perception as having two engines running simultaneously. Bottom-up processing starts with the raw sensory data and builds upward toward meaning. You're in an unfamiliar city, you hear a sound, and you piece together from scratch that it's a street musician playing guitar. Your brain assembles the perception from the ground up, purely from what the senses deliver. Top-down processing works in the opposite direction. Your prior knowledge, expectations, and context reach down and shape how you interpret incoming information. This is why you can read a sentence full of tie-ups and still understand it perfectly. Your brain fills in the gaps based on what it expects to see. A classic AP pitfall here. Students confuse which direction each process moves. Remember it this way. Bottom-up starts from the stimulus, the bottom. Top-down starts from the Gestalt principles. The brain's design rules. Your brain is a pattern-hungry machine. And the Gestalt psychologists mapped out the rules. It uses to organize sensory information into coherent wholes. The word Gestalt is German for form or shape. And the big idea is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The key Gestalt principles you need for the AP exam are separate figure ground. You naturally separate a focal object from its background. Think of the famous Weser-Face's optical illusion. Proximity. Elements that are close together are grouped as belonging together. A similarity in things that look alike are grouped together. Continuity. Your eye follows smooth, continuous lines rather than abrupt breaks. And a closure, your brain fills in missing information to perceive a complete shape, like seeing a circle even when part of its outline is missing. A good mnemonic. FPSCCS figure ground. Proximity, similarity, continuity, closure. Depth perception. How does a two-dimensional retinal image produce a three-dimensional world? Your brain uses a whole toolkit of depth cues. These fall into two categories. Binocular cues, which require both eyes, and The closer an object is, the greater the disparity. You can experience this right now. Hold a finger close to your face and alternate closing each eye. See how it jumps? That's retinal disparity at work. Monocular cues are the tricks artists have used for centuries to create the illusion of depth on a flat canvas. Relative sizes tells you that smaller objects are farther away. Interposition means that if one object overlaps another, the one in front is closer. Linear perspective is the phenomenon where parallel lines appear to converge in the distance. Think of railroad tracks meeting at the horizon. A texture gradient describes how detailed, coarse textures signal closeness, while finer textures signal distance. And a relative motion, also called motion parallax, explains why when you're riding in a car, nearby trees blur past while distant mountains seem to barely move. Perceptual constancies. Here's something remarkable. You perceive your friend as the same height, whether she's standing 2 feet away or across a parking lot, even though her image on your retina shrinks dramatically with distance. This is size constancies. Your brain automatically adjusts your perception of size based on known distance. Similarly, shape constancies. Similarly, shape constancy keeps a door looking rectangular even as it swings open and its retinal image becomes a trapezoid. Color constancy ensures that a red apple looks red under fluorescent light, sunlight, and candlelight, even though the actual wavelengths reaching your eye differ substantially. Perceptual set and context effects. Your perception is profoundly shaped by perceptual set, your mental predisposition to perceive one thing over another. Based on your experience, culture, emotions, and expectations, show someone a blurry image after priming them with animal pictures and they'll see a horse. Prime them with car pictures and they'll see a Jeep. This is top-down processing in action, and it's why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. Perception is constructive, not photographic. Common AP exam trap. Don't confuse perceptual set with inattentional blindness, which is the failure to notice an unexpected stimulus in plain sight because your attention is elsewhere. If you've never watched the famous invisible gorilla study, you're missing out. Related to this is change blindness. The surprising difficulty people have in noticing changes to a scene when their attention isn't directly focused on the change in if you've bringing it together. What the AP exam loves to test here is your ability to distinguish between these concepts and apply them to novel scenarios. If a question describes someone filling in a gap in a melody they hear, that's closure. If someone misidentifies a stranger as their friend because they're expecting to see them, that's perceptual set. Keep those labels sharp. Now that you understand how the brain constructs perception from raw sensation, we're ready to explore how the brain processes and stores the information it perceives, which brings us right into the world of memory. Part 2.2, thinking, problem solving, judgments, and decision making. All right, let's talk about thinking, which is a little meta because you're going to have to think about thinking. But stick with me because this is one of the most practically useful sections in all of AP psychology. Everything we cover here is stuff your brain is doing right now every single day, and understanding it will not only help you on the exam, but also make you a sharper thinker in real life. Concepts and mental categories. Let's start at the foundation. When you think, you don't process every object or idea from scratch. That would be exhausting. Instead, your brain organizes information into concepts, which are mental categories that group things sharing common properties. When I say bird, your brain doesn't need a definition. It conjures up a mental image almost instantly. That image is called a prototype, the most typical example of a category. For most Americans, a robin is a prototypical bird, a penguin. Technically a bird, but it takes your brain a beat longer to accept it because it breaks from the prototype. On the AP exam, be careful here, students often confuse prototypes with definitions. A prototype is your mental ideal, not a formal rule. Problem-solving strategies. Now, how do we actually solve problems? Psychologists distinguish between two major approaches. It is algorithms and retrieval. An algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that, if followed correctly, guarantees a correct solution. Think of a math formula or a recipe. Heuristics, on the other hand, are mental shortcuts. They're faster and often good enough, but they can lead you astray. Think of heuristics as the GPS that usually gets you where you're going, but occasionally drives you into a lake. Two classic heuristics show up constantly on the AP exam. The representativeness heuristic is when you judge the likelihood of something based on how closely it matches your prototype. If someone is described as quiet, detail-oriented, and loves puzzles, you might guess librarian over salesperson, even if statistically there are far more salespeople in the world. If availability heuristics, Ray, is when you estimate the probability of something based on how easily an example comes to mind. After seeing news coverage of plane crashes, people dramatically overestimate the danger of flying while underestimating far more common risks like car accidents. Availability distorts our sense of reality because memorable and frequent aren't the same thing. Obstacles to problem solving. Here's where it gets really interesting and really relatable. Sometimes our thinking actively gets in our own way. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for and favor information that confirms what we already believe. Sound familiar? It's why people only follow news sources that agree with them. Fixation is when you get mentally stuck, unable to see a problem from a new angle. Specific type is affectional fixedness, the inability to see an object as anything other than its intended use. Classic example, you need a screwdriver, but there's only a coin sitting there. Functional fixedness keeps you from realizing a coin edge works just fine. The AP loves this concept, so picture that coin. A mental set is a related trap. It's the tendency to approach new problems the same way you've solved old ones, even when a fresh approach would work better. Imagine someone who always solves math problems with brute force calculation, even when a simple pattern would make the problem effortless. Our past successes can paradoxically box us in. Judgment and decision-making. Decision-making has its own fascinating quirks. Overconfidence is perhaps the most widespread bias, the tendency to be more confident in our judgments than accuracy actually warrants. Studies show that when people say they're 99% sure of something, they're wrong far more often than 1% of the time. A little humility goes a long way. Then there's the framing effect, which proves that how information is presented dramatically changes how we respond to it. Imagine a surgery described as having a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate. Mathematically identical, psychologically very different people consistently prefer the first framing. The AP exam may describe scenarios and ask you to identify the framing effect, so watch for situations where the same data produces different choices based on wording. Belief perseverance is the tendency to cling to your initial belief even after the evidence supporting it has been discredited. It's the stubborn cousin of confirmation bias. And the hindsight bias, sometimes called the I knew it all along phenomenon, is the tendency to look back at an unpredictable event and feel like you knew it was going to happen. After an election, sports upset, or stock market crash, people are shocked by how obvious it all seems in retrospect on the exam. Hindsight bias is specifically about past events, while overconfidence is about future predictions. Don't mix them up. A helpful mnemonic to lock in the key biases, H for H, X, confirmation bias. Very confidence. Confirmation bias is creativity and insight. Finally, not all thinking is analytical. It's insight. Is that sudden aha moment when a solution clicks seemingly out of nowhere? Your brain was working on the problem below the level of conscious awareness and then delivered the answer all at once. Creativity involves generating novel, valuable ideas, and it relies on divergent thinking, brainstorming many possible solutions, as opposed to oral convergent thinking, narrowing down to the single correct answer. The AP exam tends to contrast these two. Multiple choice tests require convergent thinking. Open-ended problems reward divergent thinking. Understanding how your mind thinks, solves, and decides is powerful knowledge, and it connects directly to the next topic, where we'll explore how language shapes thought and communication. Part 2.3, Introduction to Memory. What is memory, really? Let's start with something that happened to you this morning. You woke up, maybe made coffee, scrolled your phone, and you knew how to do all of that. You didn't have to relearn your name or rediscover that hot things burn. That's memory at work, quietly running in the background of everything you do. In psychology, we define memory as the process by which we encode, store, and retrieve information. Those three words, encode, store, retrieve, are your new best friends for this unit. Think of them as the three acts of a play. First, you take information in, then you hold on to it, then you bring it back when you need it. The three-stage model, Atkinson-Shiffrin. The classic framework you need to know cold is the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, sometimes called the three-stage model or the modal model of memory. Picture a funnel. Information from the world first hits your sensory memory, a brief, almost photographic snapshot of what your senses just experienced. This lasts only a fraction of a second, maybe up to 2 seconds at most. If you've ever seen someone wave a sparkler and notice the trail of light it seemed to leave in the air, that's your sensory memory in action. That visual version is called iconic memory, while the auditory version is called echoic memory. Now, not everything in sensory memory gets through. Only what you pay attention to gets bumped into short-term memory, STM, ST. Here's where students often slip up on the AP exam. Short-term memory is not the same as long-term memory, and it has very real limitations. STM holds about 7 items, plus or minus 2 SG. That's George Miller's famous finding from 1956, sometimes called the magic number 7, and it only holds them for about 15 to 30 seconds, it's just without rehearsal. Think of STM like a sticky note on your desk. Useful, temporary, and it falls off if you don't do something with it. The process of keeping information in short-term memory by mentally repeating it is called maintenance rehearsal, as like repeating a phone number out loud until you can dial it. But if you want information to actually stick, you need elaborative rehearsal, which means connecting new information to things you already know. That's how material moves into long-term memory. LTM, our third and final stage, essentially unlimited in capacity and duration. Working memory, the update you didn't know about. Here's something that catches students off guard. Psychologist Alan Baddeley proposed an update to the short-term memory concept called working memory MREO. Rather than a simple passive storage bin, working memory is an active mental workspace. It's where you manipulate information like doing math in your head or holding a conversation while following directions. Baddeley described it as having multiple components, including a phonological loop for verbal and auditory info, a phonovely visuospatial sketchpad for visual and spatial info, and a central executive is that coordinates it all. You don't need the deep dive for the AP exam, but knowing that working memory is active and limited is essential. One powerful form of effortful encoding is deep processing, where you focus on the meaning of information rather than just its surface features. Connecting a concept to your own life, like we're doing right now, is a prime example, and research shows it leads to far better retention. A common AP pitfall here is confusing encoding is the input process. Storage is the maintenance of that encoded information over time. They're related, but they're not the same step. I'm in a Mac worth keeping. To remember the 3 stages and their sequence, try this. S8 sensors, store long. Sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. It's simple, but it mirrors the actual flow of information through the system, which is exactly the kind of connection that makes things stick. Why this matters for the exam. The AP exam loves to test whether you can apply these concepts, not just define them. You might see a scenario where someone forgets a phone number because they got distracted. That's a failure of maintenance rehearsal. in short-term memory. Or a question about why studying by making connections works better than rereading. That's elaborative rehearsal and deep processing doing their jobs. Always ask yourself, which stage is involved and what process is being described? Now that you've got the architecture of memory mapped out, let's look at the different types of long-term memory, because not all memories are created equal. Part 2.4, Encoding Memories. What is encoding, really? Let's start with a question. Have you ever studied for a test, felt completely confident, and then blanked the moment you sat down? Or maybe you can't remember what you had for breakfast 3 days ago, but you can still perfectly recall the lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 10 years. That tension, the mystery of what actually sticks in our minds, is exactly what encoding is all about. Encoding is the first step in the memory process. Think of it as the brain's way of translating experience into a format it can actually store. Before anything can be remembered, it has to be encoded. You can think of your brain like a library. Encoding is the moment a new book gets cataloged and shelved. If that step doesn't happen properly, you'll never find the book again, even if it technically walked through the front door. The 3 types of encoding. Now here's where it gets really interesting and really testable. There are 3 main ways your brain encodes information, and understanding the difference between them is crucial for the AP exam. The first is automatic processing. This is encoding that happens without any conscious effort. You're not even trying, and your brain is filing things away. Think about how you know what you had for lunch today without having studied for that knowledge, or how you can effortlessly recall that you parked on the left side of the garage. Spatial information, time sequences, and frequency of events are all encoded automatically. It's your brain running quietly in the background like a program you didn't open but is still running. The second type is effortful processing. And this is where most of your studying lives. Effortful processing requires attention and conscious work. Memorizing vocabulary, learning a formula, rehearsing a speech. All of that takes deliberate mental effort. Here's the key AP insight. Effortful processing can become automatic with enough practice. When you first learned to drive, every mirror check felt enormous. Now, you do it without thinking. That's effortful processing that became automatic through repetition. The third type is FE visual encoding, encoding images and spatial information, along with its companions, acoustic encoding, sound and language, and FE's semantic encoding, meaning. Of the 3, semantic encoding is the most powerful for long-term memory. And this is something the AP exam loves to test. When you connect a new concept to something you already understand, when you make it meaningful, it sticks far better than if you just repeated it out loud or drew a picture of it. The levels of processing framework. This brings us to a concept that elegantly unifies a lot of this material. Labels of processing, developed by Craik and Lockhart. Their big idea is that memory is not a single thing that either works or doesn't. Instead, the depth at which you process information determines how well you'll remember it later. Shallow processing is structural or phonemic. You're noticing what a word looks like or sounds like. Deep processing is semantic. You're thinking about what it means, connecting it to other ideas, generating examples. Here's a vivid way to think about it. Imagine you meet someone at a party. If you only notice their shirt color, that's shallow processing. If you actually have a 20-minute conversation and learn about their job and their dog's name and why they moved to the city, that's deep processing. Guess which person you'll remember next week? Common AP pitfall here is confusing levels of processing with the stages of memory, encoding, storage, retrieval. They're related but not the same thing. Levels of processing is specifically a theory about encoding, about how information gets in, not where it lives or how it comes back out. Mnemonics and encoding strategies. The exam will also expect you to know about specific encoding strategies, mnemonics as area or memory aids that use meaningful associations to improve encoding, acronyms, rhymes, the method of imagining information placed along a familiar route through your house. All of these work because they force semantic deep processing. They make information mean something, even if that meaning is a little silly. Chunking it is another powerful strategy. Instead of remembering 10 separate digits, you group them into meaningful clusters. That's why phone numbers are written 55 867 5309 instead of 55 8 675, 309, instead of 55, 100. It, it, if, if, And the self-reference effect tells us that information we connect to ourselves is encoded more deeply than abstract information. This is why personalizing your studying, asking where have I experienced this, is genuinely good science, not just a cute suggestion. Bringing it together. The through line of everything in 2.4 is this: encoding is not passive. Your brain doesn't just record experience like a camera. It selects, processes, and transforms information based on attention, effort, and meaning. The deeper and more meaningful the processing, the stronger the memory trace. Shallow, rushed, or distracted encoding leads to the kind of forgetting that makes you feel like the material just didn't stick, when really it was never fully encoded in the first place. Now that you understand how memories get in, it's time to explore where they go. Because in the next section, we'll dig into the different types of memory storage and what happens to information once it's been encoded. Part 2.5, Storing Memories. The library in your head. All right, let's talk about one of the most fascinating things your brain does every single day: storing memories. Think of your memory system like a library. A good library doesn't just throw every book into one giant pile. It has a front desk, a sorting room, and then deep stacks in the back where the important stuff lives for decades. Your brain works the same way, and understanding how it organizes information is exactly what the AP exam is going to test you on. Sensory memory, the blink and you'll miss it stage. Everything starts with sensory memory. This is your brain's very brief, almost unconscious snapshot of the world. When you glance at a billboard and look away but can still see it for a split second, that's your iconic memory, the visual form of sensory memory at work. The auditory version is called echoic memory, which is why you can still hear the last thing someone said even a moment after they said it. Here is what you need to remember for the exam. Sensory memory lasts only about half a second to 3 seconds, and it holds a huge amount of raw information, but almost all of it fades immediately. Unless you pay attention to it, attention is the bouncer at the door. If something gets your attention, it moves into the next stage. Working memory, your mental sticky note. Once something passes through that attentional gate, it enters working memory, which you'll sometimes see called short-term memory. Think of working memory as the sticky note on your desk, useful right now, but only if you keep glancing at it. George Miller's famous research in 1956 gave us what's sometimes called the magic number. The capacity of working memory is roughly 7 items, plus or minus 2. So somewhere between 5 and 9 chunks of information at a time. A classic AP exam pitfall here is confusing capacity with duration. Working memory holds a small amount of information, and it only lasts about 20 to 30 seconds without rehearsal. If you stop actively thinking about a phone number before you dial it, poof, it's gone. This is where rehearsal becomes critical. Maintenance rehearsal means you just repeat something over and over. Like chanting a number keeps information alive in working memory, but doesn't necessarily move it to long-term storage very effectively. Elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, is where you connect new information to something you already know. That's the strategy that actually transfers memories into long-term storage. A helpful mnemonic: elaborate to A, encode the 2 E's. Long-term memory, the deep stacks. Long-term memory is where the real magic happens. Unlike working memory, long-term memory has essentially unlimited capacity and can last a lifetime. But here's something many students get wrong. Long-term memory isn't one thing. It's divided into 2 major types, and you absolutely need to know both. Explicit memory, also called declarative memory, involves information you can consciously recall and put into words. It has 2 subtypes. Episodic memory holds your personal experiences, your first day of school, what you had for breakfast, your prom night. Semantic memory holds general world knowledge, facts, concepts, and meanings, like knowing that Paris is the capital of France. A mnemonic that helps. It is if episodic equals is
semantic and picture facts, you get implicit memory is the other side of the coin. Things you know how to do without consciously thinking about them.
procedural memory is the big one here. This is how you ride a bike, type on a keyboard, or swing a golf club. You don't consciously recall procedural memories, you just perform them. Importantly, procedural memory is largely stored in a different brain region than explicit memory. The cerebellum and basal ganglia are the key players, while the hippocampus is essential for forming new explicit memories. The process of encoding. Getting information into long-term memory requires encoding, and the depth of encoding matters enormously. This connects to the levels of processing theory developed by Craik and Lockhart. The more deeply you process information, thinking about meaning, making connections, generating examples, the stronger the memory trace. Surface level processing, like simply noticing what a word looks like, produces weak memories. That's why elaborative rehearsal wins every time over just rereading your notes. The AP exam loves to test the relationship between the hippocampus and memory formation. A famous case study you should know is HM, a patient who had his hippocampus removed to treat severe epilepsy and afterward could no longer form new long-term explicit memories. He could still learn new skills, implicit memory intact, but he couldn't remember meeting you 5 minutes later. This case was monumental in establishing the hippocampus's role in explicit memory consolidation. Common pitfalls to avoid. Students frequently mix up short-term memory and long-term memory capacity, confuse implicit and explicit memory, or forget that the hippocampus handles encoding of new memories, not storage of old ones. Those live in the cortex. Also remember, amnesia that affects the ability to form new memories is called anterograde amnesia. While retrograde amnesia affects memories from before the damage, now that you've got a solid map of how memories are stored, let's talk about what happens when that storage isn't perfect, because in the next section, we're diving into the fascinating and sometimes frustrating world of forgetting and memory retrieval failures. Part 2.6, Retrieving Memories. What is retrieval, really? Okay, so you've encoded information, you've stored it, now comes the moment of truth. Can you actually get it back? That's retrieval, and it's one of the most fascinating parts of memory because it exposes just how reconstructive and imperfect our minds really are. Here's a key insight to carry with you. Memory isn't like a video recording you press play on. Every time you retrieve a memory, you're actually rebuilding it piece by piece, which means it can change every single time you access it. Keep that in mind. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand that retrieval is an active, reconstructive process, not a passive playback. Retrieval cues, your brain's search engine. Think of retrieval cues as the search terms you type into Google. Without the right cue, your brain might struggle to pull up what you're looking for, even if the information is definitely in there. A retrieval cue is any stimulus that helps bring a stored memory back into conscious awareness. It could be a smell, a word, a place, even a feeling. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in this section. And containing specificity principle, this is the idea that memories are best retrieved when the conditions at retrieval match the conditions at encoding. In other words, you'll remember something most easily when you're in the same context, physically, emotionally, or mentally, as when you first learned it. Have you ever studied while listening to a particular playlist and then found yourself humming that song during the exam? That's encoding specificity nudging your memory. The AP exam may ask you to apply this principle to a specific scenario, so practice recognizing it in action. Two specific types of encoding specificity are especially important. A context-dependent memory refers to improved recall when you're in the same physical environment where you learned something. There's a famous study where divers who learned a word list underwater recalled it better underwater than on land, and vice versa. State-dependent memory is similar, but refers to your internal state, mood, physical arousal, or even substances. People who encode memories while in a particular emotional state tend to retrieve them more easily when they return to that same state. Neither of these are tricks. Your brain is playing on you. They're just the natural consequence of how interconnected your memories are with their surrounding context. Need recall versus recognition, not the same thing. Here's a distinction you absolutely need to nail for the exam. Recall is retrieving information without any cues, like writing an essay answer or filling in a blank. Recognition is identifying previously learned information from a set of options, like a multiple choice question. Recognition is generally easier because the answer is right there in front of you, acting as its own re- retrieval cue. That's why multiple choice tests feel easier than free response ones. And it's also why eyewitness lineups are so tricky. Just seeing someone's face can trigger a false sense of familiarity, a helpful mnemonic. Recall equals come up with it. Recognition equals pick it out. There's also S-relearning, sometimes called the savings method. This is when something you learned before takes less time to learn again, even if you couldn't consciously recall it at all. Shows that some memory trace was retained, even below the level of conscious awareness. Think of it like a path through tall grass that's been overgrown. You have to push through it again, but it's still easier than blazing a brand new trail. The tip of the tongue phenomenon and priming. You've definitely experienced this. You know something. You can almost taste it, but you just can't quite pull it up. That's the tip of the tongue to it phenomenon. And it's actually great evidence that memory retrieval isn't all or nothing. It shows that information is stored in fragments and that partial retrieval is possible even when full recall fails. Now let's talk about pitch pre-priming, which is one of the most elegant concepts in this entire unit. Priming occurs when exposure to one stimulus influences your response to a later stimulus, often without your conscious awareness. If I ask you to complete the word STEM, S-O-O-P, and you recently read the word soup, you're far more likely to write soup than S-O-O-O. Your prior exposure activated a network of associations, lowering the threshold for retrieval. Priming works on implicit memory, the kind you don't consciously know you have, and it's a beautiful reminder that much of our memory operates quietly beneath the surface. Common AP pitfall. Students often confuse déjà vu with priming or recognition. Déjà vu, that eerie feeling that you've experienced something before, is not the same as actual recognition. It's thought to arise from a brief misfiring in the retrieval process where your brain triggers the feeling of familiarity without actually surfacing a real memory. The AP exam won't ask you to diagnose déjà vu, but knowing it's related to retrieval processes, not encoding or storage, keeps you grounded. Wrapping it up, to summarize. Retrieval is an active reconstruction shaped by cues, context, internal state, and prior exposures. The better the match between encoding and retrieval conditions, the more accurate and complete your memory will be. And not all retrieval is conscious. Priming shows us that memory runs deeper than we realize. Next, we'll explore how memory isn't just imperfect, it's actually vulnerable to distortion as we dig into forgetting and the fallibility of eyewitness testimony in section 2.7. Part 2.7, Forgetting and Other Memory Challenges. Why we forget? It's not a bug. It's a feature. Let's talk about something that has probably frustrated you at least once this week, forgetting. You studied those vocabulary words, you knew that formula, and then poof, it's gone the moment you sit down for the test. But here's the thing. Forgetting isn't just some failure of your brain. It's actually a deeply important part of how memory works. Today, we're going to unpack the main reasons we forget, the ways memory can go wrong, and a few traps the AP exam loves to set for you. Encoding failure. It never went in. The first reason we forget something is almost too simple. We never really learned it in the first place. This is called mili afi nili enkadi enkaji. If this Most people can't because they never attended to those details carefully enough to encode them. The AP exam loves to use this as a trick. Don't confuse encoding failure with retrieval failure. The difference is crucial. Encoding failure means the memory was never formed. Retrieval failure means it was formed, but you can't access it right now. Decay theory. Memories fade with time. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a name worth remembering, was a 19th century psychologist who essentially used himself as a test subject to study memory. He discovered what we now call the forgetting curve, a graph showing that memory drops off rapidly at first, then levels out over time. If you've ever crammed for a test, felt great about it the next morning, and then struggled to recall the same material 2 weeks later, you've lived the forgetting curve. The underlying explanation here is VST decay theory, the idea that memory traces, called engrams, simply fade if they aren't used or rehearsed use it or lose it, basically. Interference when memories compete. Now, here's where things get really interesting. 2 types of interference can sabotage your memory, and the AP exam tests both of them constantly. So get these straight. Proactive interference is when old learning interferes with new learning. Think of it this way. You learn to drive in the United States, where you drive on the right side of the road. Now you're visiting England. Your old habit keeps proactively butting in and making the new behavior harder. Pro means forward. Old memories push forward and disrupt the new ones. Retroactive interference is the opposite. New learning interferes with old learning. Imagine you finally memorized your new locker combination, and now you can't remember your old one. The new information worked backward to mess up what you already knew. A handy way to keep these straight. Every retroactive equals every fleeces. Old memories, new stuff works backward. Every retroactive, it's the previous memories cause problems going forward. Motivated forgetting and repression. Sigmund Freud gave us the concept of repression, the idea that the unconscious mind buries painful, traumatic, or anxiety-provoking memories to protect us. More broadly, this falls under motivated forgetting, the notion that we sometimes forget because on some level we want to, while Freud's broader theories are controversial and not well supported by modern research. The basic idea that emotional content can influence memory storage and retrieval is taken seriously in contemporary psychology. On the AP exam, if you see repression, think Freud and think unconscious protection mechanism. Retrieval cues and context-dependent memory. Sometimes you haven't actually forgotten something, you just need the right trigger to find it. This is where retrieval cues come in. A retrieval cue is any stimulus that helps you access a stored memory. Ever walked back into a room and suddenly remembered what you came for? That's context working as a retrieval cue. This connects to context-dependent memory. We tend to remember information better when we're in the same environment where we learned it. There's even evidence for a state-dependent memory, which suggests our internal state, mood, arousal, even substances, can act as a retrieval cue. If you studied in a happy mood, you might recall that information better when you're happy again. Source amnesia and misinformation. One subtle but important concept is source amnesia. When you remember a piece of information but forget where you learned it. This is why eyewitness testimony can be so unreliable. You might genuinely believe you saw something when actually you heard someone describe it later and your brain filed it under things I witnessed. Related to this is Elizabeth Loftus's groundbreaking work on the misinformation effect. Post-event information can actually alter the memory of the original event. In one classic study, participants who were asked leading questions, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, later remembered seeing broken glass that was never actually in the video. Memory, it turns out, is reconstructive, not like a recording, but more like a Wikipedia page that anyone, including you, can edit. Quick AP pitfall to watch for. Students often mix up interference theory and decay theory. Decay is about time eroding a memory. Interference is about other memories competing with it. The exam will give you scenarios and ask you to identify which is happening, focus on whether another piece of learning is involved, interference, or whether it's simply been a long time with no competing information decay. With forgetting now mapped out in your memory, hopefully in a way that actually sticks, let's move forward to explore how thinking and language shape the way we process and understand the world around us. Part 2.8, Intelligence and Achievement. What is intelligence, really? Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but has kept psychologists arguing for over a century. What is intelligence? Your instinct might be to say how smart someone is, but that's exactly the kind of circular definition the AP exam wants you to move beyond. For our purposes, intelligence is the mental capacity to learn from experience, solve problems, and adapt effectively to the environment. Notice that definition doesn't say anything about grades or test scores, and that distinction matters enormously. Think of intelligence like physical fitness. A marathon runner and a power lifter are both fit, but in completely different ways. That's the heart of the debate psychologists have wrestled with. Is intelligence one general thing or a collection of distinct abilities? The G factor and Spearman's contribution. Charles Spearman noticed something interesting in the early 1900s. Students who did well in one academic subject tended to do well in all of them. He proposed that underlying all cognitive tasks was a single general mental ability he called G, or the general factor. Think of G as the engine under the hood. It powers everything. Spearman argued that specific abilities, which he called FEs, FS factors, were like individual gears, but they all ran off that same engine. The AP exam loves to test whether you can distinguish between theories that support a single general intelligence versus those that break it apart into multiple components. Spearman is firmly in the one-engine camp. Thurstone, Gardner, and Sternberg. Intelligence gets complicated. Not everyone bought Spearman's unified theory. Louis Thurstone fired back with his theory of primary mental abilities, arguing there were 7 distinct clusters of intelligence, things like verbal comprehension, numerical ability, and spatial visualization. No single G, just 7 relatively independent engines. Then Howard Gardner came along and really opened things up with his theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner proposed 8. Later, 9 distinct intelligences, including linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, bodily kinesthetics, spatial, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, and existential. You probably had a teacher who told you everyone is smart in different ways. They were channeling Gardner. The AP exam won't ask you to list all 9, but you should know the theory exists, what it claims, and the common criticism. Many psychologists argue Gardner has expanded the concept of intelligence so broadly that it becomes meaningless. Is being a gifted dancer really a form of intelligence? Or is it a talent? That debate is fair game. Robert Sternberg proposed a tighter 3-part model called the S03E02 of intelligence. Analytical intelligence, academic problem solving, creative intelligence, adapting to new situations, and practical intelligence. Emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman and Peter Salovey popularized the concept of emotional intelligence, EI, the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions effectively. Someone with high EI reads a room the way a great chess player reads a board. Critics argue EI overlaps too much with personality traits and isn't truly a form of intelligence. But the concept appears on the AP exam, so know it cold. Measuring intelligence, the IQ score. Here's the formula you absolutely need to know. The original intelligence quotient formula was S3's IQ equals mental age v chronological age times 100 S3's. So if a 10-year-old performs like a typical 12-year-old, their IQ is 12 divided 10.100, 120. Modern tests no longer use this formula. Today, IQ is a deviation IQ, which compares your performance statistically to others your age. But the original formula still shows up on AP multiple choice, so don't let it catch you off guard. Modern intelligence tests, like the Let's Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, weighs as a Stanford Binet, are designed so that scores follow over normal distribution. The famous bell curve, The mean is set at 100, and the standard deviation is 15. This means roughly 68% of people score between 85 and 115, and about 95% fall between 70 and the 130. The AP exam regularly asks you to interpret what a given score means within this distribution, so visualize that bell curve and anchor it. 100 is the middle. 15 points in either direction is one standard deviation. Flynn effect and the nature-nurture debate. Here's a fascinating wrinkle. Average IQ scores have been rising steadily across the developed world for decades. This is called the Flynn effect, named after researcher James Flynn. Because this rise happened far too quickly to be genetic, it strongly suggests that environmental factors, better nutrition, more formal education, greater exposure to abstract thinking, play a powerful role in intelligence. This is your bridge into the nature versus nurture conversation. Heritability studies on twins suggest genes matter significantly. But the Flynn effect reminds us that genes are not destiny. Achievement versus aptitude versus intelligence. One classic AP pitfall is confusing these three terms. Aptitude tests measure your potential to learn something in the future. The SAT was originally designed as an aptitude test. Aptitude achievement tests measure what you've already learned. Your exam is an achievement test. Intelligence tests try to measure underlying cognitive capacity independent of specific learn it. In practice, these distinctions blur, and the AP exam sometimes tests whether you recognize that even aptitude tests are influenced by prior education and cultural background. Stereotype threat. Claude Steele's concept of stereotype threat is essential here. When people are aware of a negative stereotype about their group and fear confirming it, that awareness itself impairs their performance. It's a cognitive tax anxiety, eats up working memory resources. Stereotype threat helps explain some group differences in test scores without attributing those differences to fixed ability, and is a concept the AP exam treats as highly significant. Coming up next, we'll shift from how we think about intelligence to how we store and retrieve the information we learn, diving into the fascinating and sometimes frustrating world